All right, well, thank you for having me. My name is Natalie Munoz. I am a recent PhD graduate from Howard University from their School of Social Work. I studied understanding how historically Black colleges and universities shape the ethnic, racial identity, and mental health of Afro-Latino college students. I'm originally from New York City, Dominican and Cuban, born and raised in Queens, New York. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about my story and how I became a professor. I'm currently now a professor at Rutgers University.
So let's talk about that journey. How did you go from being a kid in New York to wanting to be an educator, and specifically in what you studied?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really honestly kind of fell into it. I didn't really know. Both my parents went for like a semester at like a community college in Queens, but they never finished because they got pregnant with me and my brother. So navigating college, I felt kind of like on my own, even though my grandfather had actually gone to college and studied to be a civil engineer. But it was like so long ago that he didn't really have like, you know, the resources, you know, because college had changed so much to really like support me in my journey. But I knew that, you know, education was important and I wanted to go to college. And so I applied to Stony Brook University. I didn't even know what the campus looked like. I had no idea in terms of like what to look for in a college. But I was like, it's 2 hours away, so I could kind of get away from, you know, like my home, but also come back and visit whenever I wanted. And it was a quality education that was affordable because it's a state school. So I ended up going to Stony Brook. I studied psychology. I actually initially went in thinking I was going to do biology, but I hated science. So I failed. They wanted me to like mate flies, and I was like, no.
A little perverted.
I was like, I'm not gonna mate flies. And I think I got like a C in that class. It was like the first time I ever like didn't do well in school. And I was like, you know what, this is just not for me. And so I started to love my psychology classes. And so I ended up switching my major to psychology. And so while I was on campus, there was a position called a resident assistant, which is like a student who's kind of a student leader who can like take care of basically the incoming freshmen who are living in the residence halls. And when you do that, they pay for all your housing. And I was like sold, because my dad was like, yeah, you're gonna go to college, but you're gonna have to figure it out financially. So I was like, okay. So I had to figure out like how to finance college on my own, really. And so that allowed me to. I became a resident assistant and actually loved it. I loved working in the residence halls. I loved being a leader. I loved like if student was depressed or feeling homesick, like being that person that they could come to and get support, who could like route them to the counseling center. And I think that's kind of how I started to think about, you know, my role in terms of what kind of work I wanted to do in the community and how much I enjoyed like helping other students. So after graduating, I ended up going back to school and getting a master's in social work, because I just saw so many students dealing with different things like sexual trauma or going through grief as a college student, or just depression from a breakup, right? And like there's just so many things that happen between that like 7 to 21 age in college that are like pivotal to like what you decide to do with your life and how you know, create life moving forward. And so I just really wanted to have a hand in that. So I worked at colleges and universities for like 17 years building mentorship programs for Black and Latino college students, and I loved it. But the glass ceiling for Latina women was just super thick. And I realized that, you know, I had colleagues who are white and even colleagues who were like Black males who were getting promoted. And even though I was making the university like millions of dollars, they felt like I wasn't good enough to get promoted. And so at that point I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go back to school. I'm gonna get my PhD, because obviously if you don't have a PhD, it's not valued in higher education. And then more than that, if you're Latina in higher education, there's just like, you're dealing with both, you know, the patriarchy and sexism, but also racism, right? And so that's kind of like what led me to getting the PhD. But I ultimately thought after getting the PhD in social work that I would continue in student affairs, because trying to get into a faculty position is highly competitive. And more so, I didn't really have a lot of research experience going into it. So a PhD is considered like a research-based degree, right? So usually people who apply have maybe publications already. Like I applied 26 times to get into PhD programs before I got my first yes to go to Howard. And I had faculty tell me like, oh, well, don't bother, like at Columbia, when I applied there, a white faculty member approached me and she was like, you shouldn't even bother applying again. She was like, because they only accept white and Asians. And I was like, taken back, you know, but I was like, you know what? If that's not where I can be my authentic self and where I'm going to be accepted, like I don't want to study there, you know? And so I started looking at HBCUs because I was like, I really just want to be around my community. I want to be around Black people. And so when I got into Howard, I was like thrilled because I felt like, wow, I'm finally going to be around my community and have this amazing opportunity to be centered in like Black excellence.
That's an incredible story, and I think it's so useful to young people and people who are just like lost, which is a lot of people. And a lot of people may think about your journey and they can kind of like visualize themselves going through it, but you vocalizing that is very useful. I think that's something that like we can clip this on its own and be like, here's what it can look like for you if you want to go to college and not pay for housing.
Right.
If you want to go for something that you're passionate about, but you feel like there's obstacles in the way. So it's just a great story. But you mentioned you loved being a leader as an RA. What was your leadership style then? And is it the same as now? And what's your leadership style?
I mean, I really honestly, as a social worker, I like to meet people where they're at, right? And like understand what their strengths are, what their gifts are, and help them build confidence in their, not only their self-esteem, but in their power to be able to do those things. Because I feel like, especially now with social media, we're constantly, as people of color, being told like we're not good enough to sit in the boardroom, or we're not good enough to be the president, or we're not good enough to become doctors, right? So trying to figure out, like, I think what their gifts are, and really just helping them facilitate growth in that area. And like the belief and inner belief that they can actually accomplish whatever it is that they want to accomplish. And I think going back to what you said earlier, it's like, you know, a lot of times we're confused. I think that's so human. Like, I don't even know what I want to do when I grow up. And I'm about to be 40 this year. And sometimes even now as a professor, I'm still navigating, is this the right career path for me? You know, like even though I love teaching, I'm still also like exploring the other aspects of it, because it's not just teaching. Like if, depending on what institution you work at, right? So if you're at a research 1 or a research 2, there's different levels of how much writing and how much research you have to do. And the research levels depends on the funding that the university is getting from grants, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, like there's a certain millions amount of dollars that a university has to bring in grants so that they can actually qualify to be like a research 1 level institution. To be considered
a certain tier. Right?
Exactly. So if you're at a higher tier in terms of research and grants,
you get more money.
There means that there's more money at the university that's coming in through grants, but also a higher expectation on faculty to do more research and to do more publications. Not necessarily because they have more funding, because the funding doesn't necessarily go to you. You have to apply for your own grants. Oh. Yeah.
So it's just expectations based on the rep.
Exactly. It's like if you think about it in sports, right? Like, if you go to a school that is Division 1 or Division 2 or Division 3, right? There's different expectations.
It's like why
on the
athlete. That.
Right.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, and that's what I think a lot of the issues with academia are, and like the expectations and hiring. It's
right.
Like, well, what are you hiring based off of? If the name means nothing but the name, or how much money is sitting on campus.
Right.
then what does it mean?
Yeah, it can get really complicated.
Yeah.
But ultimately, like if I wanted to work at a CUNY, like a City University of New York, my focus would be teaching. So there's no like requirements necessarily for like research and scholarship, because they are considered more community based, and their focus is on pedagogy and teaching. But because I'm at Rutgers, and Rutgers is considered a Research 1 institution, but it depends on the campus. Their New Brunswick campus is considered Research 1. The Newark campus, that's the one that I'm working at, is considered Research 2. So there's just different expectations in terms of how much you have to publish, and that will determine whether you go up for tenure or not. And tenure is the ability to stay at an institution indefinitely, basically until you retire. And so usually you go up for tenure in your 5th year at the institution. And you have to present all the research that you've done, all the publications that you've done. You have to show that you actually have good teaching skills based on feedback from students, evaluations. And then the third thing that they look for is that you're doing service in the community, but also with students. But the highest, if you're at a Research 1 institution, that they're gonna look at the most is what are you producing in terms of research and publications. The other two things are important, but if you're not doing publications, you won't make tenure.
Right. I love the idea that you were saying you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. And I think that that's shared with so many people right now because of the nature of society right now and the job market, whatever you want to call it. Things are just totally up in the air.
Right.
And I think as people re-emphasize things like connection to the earth, like health to yourself, mental health, all this stuff, like people care about that more again.
Right.
So the idea of life and lifespan is now longer, and as it should be. Life is very long. Instead of thinking of your career trajectory as something that's like, you only have the first few years to make your mark, and then after that, it's all over. That's not the case, and people are realizing that. So they're adopting your mindset, which is, I can be working for 40, 50 years before I get to do what I love. So what does that look like for you? What you would want to do that you love? Not necessarily something that's like generating a salary, but something that you want to accomplish or do that you will love.
That's a great question. I think part of the challenge in answering that is that I'm at a point in my life where I don't dream of labor, right? Like I see my mental health and my peace and my work-life balance as so essential that I dream about other things like happiness, partnership, like community, love, family. And so while I enjoy what I do for a living, I don't work to live. I live, like there's some people who live to work, and then there's some people who work to live. And I'm in a state where I'm trying to work to live. The reason why I feel like, I'm still torn in terms of if I see myself in academia, for the long term is because as a person of color, as an Afro-Latina Black woman, I want to make sure that my impact, wherever I'm at, I'm able to utilize my strengths, utilize my creativity, utilize my leadership to make the biggest impact on my community, right? And so previously in the work that I was doing, I had like 350 students that were in a mentorship program, and I was able to bring their retention from like 30 to 40% to 90% in 3 years. So that's like a large impact that I'm making. Now I'm teaching classes, but the classes are around maybe 15 to 20 students in each class, right? And my focus is more on the writing. So what I do like about the position right now is that in terms of my time, I can create my own schedule. I can decide if I want to go into the office, if I want to work from home. I only have to go in when I teach. And then you get winters off, technically, kind of, and you get summers off. But a lot of people will end up writing during winter and summer because that's the time when they're not teaching and they can actually focus. But technically you have off, you know, like a winter break when the students have break and a summer break. So I like the lifestyle and I love the flexibility of it. But I'm also trying to figure out, like, okay, well, how can I have a larger impact on my community and do this work, right? And maybe that's something that I have to navigate in terms of what kind of service I'm doing on campus, or just like connecting to more faculty to get more ideas to see, like, you know, what else I can get involved in. But it's a balance, because the more you get involved, you know, outside the classroom and outside your research, the less time you have to write, right? And then that impacts whether you can stay at the university or not. Yeah, and I think writing is also like socially isolating, right? Oh, yeah. Even though, like, you know, sometimes I do enjoy, you know, reading and writing, but when you're always by yourself doing something, it can be draining, you know? And so I'm also like just navigating that, like, how does that make sense for me? And I love actually more creative outlets, like, for example, this podcast. I love speaking in public, you know, and in academia, while there's some institutions that are moving towards more like creative outlets for faculty, some of it feels stifling because the expectation is to publish in an academic journal, right? Which a lot of people in our community don't have access to that because they're behind a paywall, right? The only time you have access to those like academic articles or journals is if you're enrolled in an institution, right? So it's almost like a clash. Like universities are trying to be more diverse by bringing in more Latino faculty, but then it's like, okay, well, if I'm coming in as a Latina faculty with the hope of making the most impact in the Latino community, then why am I writing in journals that only majority of white people have access to?
Yeah.
Right? So there's like a clash in values for me that I'm like still navigating in terms of, is this the best position for me? You know, and it could be maybe I just want to teach and I go to a CUNY and I focus on a CUNY. But if I decide to do that, then you have to teach six classes, usually like a semester. So we'll see. I'm kind of like open to like whatever the universe like takes me, and like really just trying to focus on, you know, what makes me happy in this moment, and allowing for life and like the spirit to like guide me in terms of what's the next step.
Yeah, that's just what life is like being carried away. Like,
right.
We're not in control of anything. We're just being pulled along. But what you do to cope with that current is how you define your life, like your coping mechanisms. Right. The things you do to make you feel better. Your habits, like who you interact with, and your behaviors. That's really all you can do. There's nothing else outside of those things. And right now in society, because there are so many variables and coping mechanisms available, there's so many ways to escape. That kind of becomes people's lives, is the escape and the coping themselves. So how do you think that people can healthily cope in a way that also keeps them on track with where they want to go, as opposed to being either washed away or jumping into an escapist hole?
That's a great question. And I think it's different for everyone, right? But for me personally, I mean, therapy has been huge for me. I highly recommend it, especially for people of color. If they've never tried therapy, I would say therapy is almost like dating. Like, not every therapist is going to be the right fit, you know, like just like not every partner is for you. So you have to kind of find a therapist that's kind of aligned with your values, because that can also be like a clash, right? I think, you know, being open to different kinds of like healing practices. Like, I've recently tried a Limpia. I don't know if you know what that is. Limpia in English means like a cleansing. And it's a spiritual practice rooted in like Afro-Indigenous like spirituality. But for a lot of like Caribbeans, especially if they're Christian, it's considered like satanic or like of the devil, because there's just so much anti-blackness in the Caribbean, right? And so due to colonization, there was this huge push for people to be Christian, to be Catholic in the Caribbean. And so we've kind of like, not everyone, but a good amount of Afro-Latinos have kind of lost those spiritual practices in the process because of enslavement, because of anti-blackness, and because of colonization. And so I was like, you know what? I really want to try this. Like, it's rooted in like basically helping you to like realign your mind, your body, and your spirit. And I absolutely loved the experience. Like, it was probably the most peaceful and loving experience I've ever like participated in terms of like a healing practice.
And describe it. Yeah, how'd it go?
I don't know. So I did it with a healer. Her name is Hassani. She has like she works at Cabrini Wellness, which is like uptown in Washington Heights. And she uses like elements of like Mother Nature, so like roses, feathers. She used drumming, a lot of like guided imagery, just basically like understanding like where I was in life and what I needed to let go of, but also what I needed to bring into my life. And so obviously like a lot of prayer, but it was just like really beautiful. Like the guided imagery alone, I think, was like super powerful for me. And it just left me feeling like super centered, and like I said, like almost like a high. Like I honestly felt like a body high.
Do you meditate? Do you do any like mindfulness type stuff?
I do meditate, I do mindfulness, but this was like beyond anything I had ever experienced.
How long was it?
It was like 90 minutes.
Oh, okay, so you were like fully in there.
Yeah.
That's a really good suggestion that I don't hear too often. People will say like meditate, go on walks, like exercise and stuff, and like those are like routine things you can do. Mm-hmm. But some of these one-of-one experiences can really transform your life, especially if you have a good connection with the person who's guiding you.
Right. And I felt that with her. Like when you just meet someone and it's like her energy was just glowing. Mm-hmm. And I was like, immediately my spirit was like attracted to her. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm just gonna sign up. And it was like actually like a raffle at a Dominican nonprofit fundraising event. And I was like, she was like offering like her services as like, part of the fundraising. And I was like, I'm just gonna sign up and see what happens. And I ended up like winning the raffle. And it was like the best decision I made, But I think part of it is like, as people of color or as Black people, we often ignore those feelings of depression and anxiety. Like we're just taught to kind of like ignore it and let it build up. Like it'll just go away if we don't like think about it. Or like if we hate a job, it's like, no, I gotta do this because whatever. Like we create these kind of like almost like limitations in our mind rather than sitting with that discomfort and saying, well, why do I feel depressed right now? Like, why do I feel anxious? Like, what is at the root of that? And what can I do, or what do I need to change in my life to feel more in alignment, right?
And I think so many people feel that, and now there's a lot of messaging about this. A lot of people do hear what you just said, which is like, communities of color are more affected, and like we think about it, and everyone's like, yeah, me too. But then it's like, okay, well, what now? Mm-hmm. The answers are like targeted as for like Adderall on your newsfeed, Like there's no clear way to do any of this because it's not profitable and it's not sexy. You need to really get down to the nitty gritty to really self-discover and find ways to heal.
No, for sure. And there's just such a stigma with, with therapy in general. I think within our community, it's like, oh, if you go to therapy, like, tu ta loca, like you're crazy, like there is no gray area in our community. It's like either you're good or you're not good and you're in therapy because you're crazy. But the reality is, it's like life is hard, and there's so much comparison happening with social media. And one of my favorite quotes from like Bell Hooks, she's like a feminist scholar, is she talks about like healing never happens like in an individual way. It always happens in community, right? So I feel like the most important thing that we can do is to find communities that really uplift us and provide collective healing, whether it's through a Limpia or through therapy or through just being to vent to friends who like believe in you and your growth and can be honest with you in this life path, you know?
I think a lot of people are also lonely. You know, above all, that's what this lack of community is bringing, is not just like, there's no sense of belonging, but there's also just nothing almost to do. There's no people around, there's nothing. You know, community is a privilege almost. But to not even have other people or things to do creates this grim sense of loneliness that's like every day. For most people right now. I mean, if I can speak for them. So what do you think this loneliness epidemic is going to look like as it continues and increases? Because, you know, it's going to be more isolating over the next few years.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if I agree with you per se, but I do think like post-pandemic, social isolation has been like a real concern for a lot of people.
Right.
But I feel like for younger generations, it's gonna take a lot of work on like stepping out of their comfort zone, right? Because like we don't realize how important community is, and sometimes we think like, oh, I could just do it by myself. I don't need to ask for help. The biggest thing that I did with students when I was working through the mentorship program, and it sounds silly, but it's so simple, is helping them figure out how to ask for help.
And so you think it's just as straight as that? Like,
yeah.
I need help with this is bothering me.
Yeah.
What should I do?
But you're saying it like it's easy. Like, when was the last time you asked someone for help?
I'm pretty open and like upfront with my emotions. So like, I do it somewhat often, but maybe not so directly like
Right.
that. Maybe I can acknowledge there's something like, oh, I could use help with this. I'll go to this person. But in terms of being like super vulnerable, like, I need help, it's not easy.
Yeah. I think for most people it's not easy.
Yeah.
Like it's hard. It's hard to say like, you know, I'm feeling depressed or I'm having these thoughts or I need assistance with something, because you like in this world, like there's just so much comparison, and then there's like, oh, everybody's successful, different definitions of what success looks like. Like I was literally just talking to my friend about it this morning, because she was like, I don't feel like I'm successful enough. And I was like, well, how are you defining success? I'm like, because you might look at me and be like, oh, well, Natalie has a doctorate, so she's super successful. And she doesn't have a doctorate. But she actually has more money than me, because she doesn't have $200,000 in debt. She actually owns, like during that 5 years that I was in like college, she was working and saving, and she bought property, right? So she has more equity than me. And I was like, I was like trying to just challenge her in her own definition of what success looks like, because for everyone it's different.
Some of the happiest people on earth are people living in the third world that have no access to technology. They're suffering by our definitions,
Right.
But they have perhaps a family or a little community where they know how to cook food that they can access every day, and that's enough for them. But for us, we have these like huge lofty ideas about what security and safety are like, and then luxury is something that we come to expect. Instant gratification is just everywhere. Everybody needs everything like now. Whereas success and all this stuff, you can define it, you know, by goals and stuff. You can say, I want to look like this, or I want it to be like this in a few years, and measure against that. But really it's about how you feel, and about like, can you look back on what you've done and be proud of it?
Right.
Pride is like a huge thing. I wanted to talk about culturally responsive curriculums. And is that something that it's like a passion of yours, or something you want to see more of? And could you just also like explain what they are?
Yeah, so in my research, basically, I was kind of trying to understand, like I said earlier, like how historically Black colleges and universities shape the ethnic racial identity, but also the mental health of Afro-Latino college students. And so what I found in that was that for these students, for a lot of them who were attending HBCUs, they didn't really see their identity, like Afro-Latinidad, in the curriculum. Like there were 1 or 2 courses that existed, but they were hard to find, and the only way they knew about it was through word of mouth, right? Because the challenge is that a lot of times universities collect information or data about students using federal government regulations. So it's like, you know, the typical like census, like, oh, are you Black, are you white, are you Asian, etc. So it kind of always makes Afro-Latinidad kind of fall between the cracks, right? So if you go to HBCU and you ask, well, how many of your students are Afro-Latino? They don't know.
Right.
You know, because they're not collecting that data, right? And then on top of it, if you're an Afro-Latino going to an HBCU and you see yourself in the curriculum, like research shows is like that only heightens your knowledge of self, it heightens your self-esteem, and it also heightens your ability to have like a positive ethnic racial identity. When you don't see yourself in the curriculum, it can have negative implications, like even low self-esteem or depression, or like I said, like a low knowledge of self. So my argument was that if universities can create more culturally responsive curriculums and increase students' positive ethnic racial identity, then students are going to graduate from college not only with a great amount of skills in their field, but also with the confidence that they need to push through to get to the positions that they want in those fields, right? It's great if you have math skills, right? But if you graduate college and you still don't think that your voice matters because you've been oppressed and you're Black, or because of all these discrimination you've experienced, of all these violence against Black bodies that we have to like see every day on social media, then you're not going to go for the job that pays, you know, $85,000 or $100,000 after graduation. You're going to settle for the $30,000 job, or you're not going to believe that you deserve the promotion to director or VP, and you're going to settle for assistant, right? So it's like, it's not to say that all those jobs don't matter, they all matter, but my point is, how do we get people to their highest potential, right?
And the self-esteem has a lot to do with it.
Exactly.
And the representation within courses also makes it seem more relevant.
Exactly.
But talk about the identity thing itself, right? Like that's probably the biggest thing you studied, is that this is something that is very relevant, but it's also new, you know, like this sense of super mixed post-colonial identity. What does that mean to you? Let's just talk about that.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's new. I would say it's becoming more relevant now, but it's been like this. Like Afro-Latinos have been going to historically Black colleges since since the civil rights movements, you know? At the moment HBCUs open their campuses, if you were Black, that's the only school you could attend if you wanted a higher, education degree. And so the challenge is that we don't necessarily talk about that, right? Because there's this binary in the United States. You're Black or you're white, right? And so when they saw Black Dominicans back in the 60s or the 70s, they weren't thinking like, oh, that's a Dominican. They're like, oh no, that's another Black person. Send them to the HBCU, So I feel like our voices are being more amplified now, right? But it's definitely not a new thing. I think in terms of identity, for so long, our histories have been erased. If you go to the Black Studies Center, it's usually centered around African American history. If you go to the Latino Studies Center, it's centered around Chicano history, right? And so where does the Afro-Latinidad piece fall? And I think now you'll see a little bit more people kind of like highlighting Afro-Latinidad, but it's definitely not where it needs to be. And I think the assumption is for a lot of MSIs, which are minority serving institutions, like Hispanic serving institutions or HBCUs, is that there's this assumption that because there's so much diversity that we don't need to talk about race or we don't need to talk about ethnic identity. But the reality is that we do, because there's a lot of challenges due to colorism, due to socioeconomic status that separates us from the history of colonization. And if we're going to build true like Black and brown solidarity, I feel like universities that have that much diversity need to make a more concerted effort to talk about those challenges within our communities. And I feel like it's not happening to the extent that I would like for it to be happening, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I think that's so true, that the conversation needs to not only continue, it needs to really start. It hasn't. A lot of these ethnic racial conversations start after like big news events, like the George Floyd incidents started months of protests and discussions about it, but then they stopped. And now we're here where it's like nobody talks about anything related to this in a really public way because it's not exciting anymore. It's not social media worthy. There's nothing really to generate from it, which is dangerous, really dangerous, because then it can be flipped in the other way, which is weaponized. How are you dealing with this, outside of your work? How do you do this in a day-to-day way? Like, how do you attack this conversation, that has a bunch of stigma around it, but without disrupting social norms, even though it's not normal to have like this kind of society where we don't talk about something that's so prevalent?
Yeah, well, I think the only way to do it is to disrupt. And I think just me being at a university is disruptive, right? Because it's like, I think it's like less than 2% of faculty, the numbers is really low, are Latina, right? But even in the courses that I teach, I make sure that I include like a Black transnational perspective so that students can understand the challenges that not only Blacks face here in the United States, but that the challenges actually look similar in Colombia, in Dominican Republic, in Cuba, right? That there is Black people all over Latin America that are experiencing similar challenges. And so just this semester I brought in a Black faculty member from Colombia who's living there. He's actually Caribbean, but he made a decision to go to Colombia because he felt like that was like the best place that he could uplift the economy for Black people in the diaspora. And so the students, he's like a great colleague of mine, and the students really, really loved his guest speech. And so for me, it's really about making sure that I'm infusing voices from all over the diaspora in my teachings so that students can understand that it's beyond just the United States, right? And to really think about the Black global collective.
So how do you do it on a very personal level? Because this is your background. So how do you explain this to somebody? Or if somebody were to ask you, there's all the different questions. What's your nationality? What race are you? What's your ethnicity?
Yeah.
What are you? Sometimes people are just like, give me the whole thing. How do you explain that? And do you change your answer depending on who's asking? Because, if a certain kind of person is asking you, like, what are you? It is a different question than like, oh, where are your parents from? What's your heritage? They're all different.
No, that makes sense. So I grew up in Elmhurst, Queens, which is like one of the most diverse neighborhoods in all of the country.
Yeah, in one of the whole world.
And so that was like a blessing for me because I got exposed to more diversity than I think most people have.
Right.
And at the same time, I still dealt with a lot of discrimination. Like I remember as early as maybe like 8 or 9 years old, experiencing a lot of anti-Blackness in my community of like, I felt like I had to straighten my hair all the time. Like I felt like I wasn't beautiful with curly hair. And so I had to I would like seek out ways to kind of like kill the curl, right? So there was one time when I got into like 17, I finally got in like saved up enough for my job. I spent $500 to put formaldehyde in my hair to basically completely straighten my hair permanently. And the only way to get rid of the straight hair was actually to like cut my hair off at that point. And, you know, now looking back, I'm like, wow, you know, they used to tell me I had bad hair. And now I wear my hair authentically curly, and all the time people tell me like, oh wow, your curls are so beautiful, right? And then fast forward to like I was like around 15. I mean, I didn't even know I was Black during this time, right? Like I only knew I was Latina. And so a woman came up to me and was like, oh, why don't you get back on your banana boat and go back where you came from? It was like a white woman from my neighborhood. And I thought, get back on my banana boat. Like, I'm from here. Like, what are you talking about? Like, my parents are from here. My grandfather and my grandmother, they were the ones born in Dominican Republic and Cuba. But both my parents were born in Spanish Harlem and Harlem, right? So for her to say that to me, I realized, like, wow, like, you know, like, this woman does not think I belong here in the United States, right? Like, I'm not, quote unquote, American enough, right? But then around 13, I went to Dominican Republic, and because my Spanish didn't have like a similar Dominican accent, they were like, well, you're not Dominican, right? So now I'm in Dominican Republic, I'm not Dominican enough. I'm in the United States, I'm not American enough, right? And then going to the HBCU, I thought like, wow, I'm gonna be around my people. You know what I mean? Like I had been at predominantly white institutions my whole life, and I was so excited, and still I was met with, well, you're not Black enough, right? And so I think for Afro-Latinos, it can be very challenging sometimes when you feel like you never fully belong in any of your communities. But I think, you know, you have to do your own research on your identity and what you feel comfortable with, and not allow other people to define your identity. Because I feel like that's a personal journey. Mm-hmm. And so based off of my research and knowing that 95% of Cuba is Black and 95% of Dominican Republic is Black, and that most of those Africans were brought over as slaves because of the transatlantic slave, like I know that I'm Black. I might be lighter skinned, right? I might have an Americanized New York City accent, but that doesn't make me any less Latina, that doesn't make me any less Black, and that definitely doesn't make me any less American. And so I don't really care who asks me, they're gonna get the same answer, you know? And I think that path for everyone is gonna look different, you know? Like, how do you get to a point where you have a positive association with what it means to be your authentic self?
How do you think you can get more connected with that? How do you think you can have more of a positive perspective of who you are?
Yeah, I think it's like surrounding yourself with people from your community, right? And like my grandparents were so old, they didn't want to teach me how to cook, you know? And I feel like cooking connects me to my ancestors in ways that maybe not a lot of people acknowledge. But when I smell the aroma of like tostones or of like garlic or of plátanos, like that makes me feel like I'm with my grandmother, you know? It reminds me of my ancestors. And so they were too old. They didn't have the patience to teach me how to cook. I went to YouTube and I figured it out. Like I taught myself how to dance. I've taken a lot of dance classes. I actively sought books on Afro-Latinidad because they were erased from my curriculums in middle school, in high school, and in college, right? Like I didn't see my first like Afro-Latino book until my PhD program. And so it's like, for a lot of us in the diaspora, we have to kind of do our own education.
Right.
Because even if you look at what's happening in Florida and a lot of states right now, they're trying to remove Black history, right? And so it's like, even now more than ever, like making sure that we are educating ourselves on our own history, whether it's instead of listening to music, you know, while you're in the car, put on a podcast about Black history, You know, put on a podcast on Afro-Latinidad history. You know, I think travel is a great thing, although I recognize that it's a privilege, but going to college allowed me the opportunity to live abroad. You know, I got into a program that allowed me to live abroad for a year. I was living in Spain and teaching English. And when I did that, I was literally like, you know, you cross the Strait of Gibraltar and you're in Africa from Spain. It's literally a ferry right away. And I did that. I went to Africa and it was the best experience that I ever had. Like, I was eating empanadas in Africa. I mean, obviously they have a different name for it. But when you're sitting there and you're eating something that it's like exactly what your community eats.
It's like full circle.
It's full circle.
Yeah.
100% full circle. And then I also went to South Africa, which, if you look at the history of the apartheid and what has happened there with colorism, it's almost identical to what has happened in the United States because of slavery, right? And so traveling really allows you to open up your mind to realize that racism is systemic, you know? And it also allows you to reconnect to your roots, to your history, and acknowledge that, like, well, actually, like, this is like where you would have been had it not been for enslavement. Mm-hmm. You would have still been eating empanadas and probably dancing to congos, but you would have been doing that in Africa. Right? Not in, you know, Harlem or New York City or Brooklyn.
That's very powerful. So let's talk about music then, because music really does seem to have this spellbinding effect that can connect you to your ancestors, to yourself, to whatever the artist is going through at the time of making the song or what the song is about. So what's some music that makes you feel good, I guess I would frame it as? What music do you go to? What feels proper and good? I know for me, at least, it wouldn't be the same answer as like what I typically listen to. Sometimes there's music that's like special and reserved for this feeling that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think for me, the drums. And I think, like, that was like what I mentioned earlier about the Limpia. Like, the drumming part of it was so, and it intensified my emotions in a way that was so powerful, right? And so, but I think back, like, drumming was used as a form of resistance during enslavement. Like, people would drum to build community and to say, like, this is the time that we're moving out. Mm-hmm. This is the route out. This is how we're getting there. Like, if you were far away on another field, you wouldn't hear them if they screamed, but if they drum, you can hear it, right? And so sometimes I feel drumming in such a deep and profound way that I feel like it goes beyond just the moment and it connects me to my ancestors. Like, anything with drums, my mind and my body is just, and my spirit is blown. Like, I love drumming circles. I love, like, salsa because of the drums.
Hip hop.
Like,
it's all drums.
I like anything that has drums. I'm here for it.
Yeah, it's like that physical. It's real physical. To me, that's the thing that.
It's hard to even describe how it makes you feel, because it's just like this, like, energy that comes over me that I'm like, whew, fully immersed in that moment. You know, like when you go into like flow, like a state of flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what drumming does for me.
Yeah, states of flow are like, that's what we were talking about before. Is like, if you are engaging in vices or escapes or like coping, you can't get into that state of flow because the state of flow is achieved after some kind of friction. You have to jump into the state of flow. You have to relax to get into it, or you have to like physically get into it if you're like doing something physical. It takes work to get into that flow state. And then once you're there, your mind is right, your body's right, you're doing something, you're producing something. And that's what a lot of people are lacking. And that just takes spiritual health really overall. It's not just the mental and physical health, it's really the spiritual health that you have to have in order to get to that flow state. And music really, really, the right kind of music like can get you there.
I agree. I agree. I think though, physical though, like, you'd be surprised how starting off simple with physical stuff can push you in that direction,
Right,
though.
exactly.
Like just working out,
Yeah.
walking, any kind of movement, dancing.
Yeah.
You know, like even if I'm not feeling well or I'm depressed or I'm anxious, like if I just start moving, like I'm already starting to feel a little bit better. Like I might not be 100%, but it's like at least I know that I'm loving on myself, and that act of loving on myself brings me closer to center, if that makes sense.
It's one foot in front of the other.
Right.
Like that's all you really have to do. It's sometimes way harder to see that at other times, like way harder.
Right.
But that is all you need, and that's all you're ever really doing. Sometimes it feels like the steps are coming a lot quicker, but it's because you're doing more. And that brings me to life transitions. That's something that you wanted to talk about. Do you feel like you're in a pivotal moment in your life? And also talk about those pivotal moments that you've had already.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm about to turn 40 in February, and I definitely feel like I'm in a major life transition because of that. I think we grow up with these expectations like centered around age, and what success looks like at each age is very different, right? And when you don't meet those expectations at that age, you feel like a failure, right? And I think for women, a lot of times there's an extra pressure of like, you should be married by a certain age, or you should be having a child by a certain age. And I obviously have not met those expectations, right? And so for me, that has been really hard for me to like grieve, and I'm currently working on letting that go, right? Like letting that go and relinquishing that need for like control, but also like expectation, and just like giving it to God and to the universe and to spirit to say that if this is meant for me, this will come, and I don't need to have to stress about it or feel depressed about it. And that where I'm at right now is actually like pretty good. Like I'm in a good space, if that makes sense.
It does. It definitely does. And that's like the right mentality. I think that for me, it's easy to employ for myself. Like whatever will be, will be.
Right.
Like, I really am that way, positive or negative. But it's not easy for other people to feel that because of all of their past traumas piling up to make it feel like this is not fair.
Right.
I think that's what a lot of people fear, is that it's not fair. And it's not. Life is not fair, but it's about your perspective on it.
Right.
So finally, I want to make sure that people know where they can go or how they can learn about the issues that we've been talking about, but specifically what you teach about, because it is so important. This identity thing is so important, and it's also history, which is crucial.
Right.
But it's so relevant now. I find it personally very useful to teach people using resources. So what are some resources that they can access, and what are some of the things they can do? How can they just start? I think people see this and they think, well, I feel this way, but I want to do something about it. What can I do?
Yeah. Well, one of the books I would recommend is the Afro-Latino Reader. I think that's like a great start. It's a dope book that pretty much centers the experiences of Afro-Latinos in the United States. And reading it for me was extremely powerful. It gave me the words, and it validated my experience of belonging and the challenges with what I spoke about earlier, which is triple consciousness, right? Like never feeling Black enough, never feeling American enough, but also never feeling Latino enough, right? And like it's a collective of different stories of Afro-Latinos in the United States and their experiences with identity, with race. And so I think that's a great place to start if it's something that you're interested in exploring.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for coming, sharing, being open with me. I appreciate it so much, and it was just fun. Great time talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Red. I appreciate it.